When the rebellion of 1857 was finally crushed, India was quiet again. But the silence was not peace. It was the silence that follows shock. Entire regions had been devastated, cities damaged, villages erased, and trust permanently broken. The British East India Company had survived the uprising, but its authority had not. What the rebellion revealed was impossible to ignore. A private company, driven by profit and protected by force, could no longer be trusted to rule millions of people. For over 100 years, Britain had allowed the company to act in its name. The arrangement had been convenient. Wealth flowed into Britain. Administration costs were kept low. Responsibility was blurred. But the events of 1857 exposed the danger of that system. When control failed, Britain could no longer hide behind corporate distance. In London, the response was swift and decisive. British leaders concluded that India could no longer be governed indirectly. The risks were too high, the costs were too great, and the consequences of another rebellion would be catastrophic. In 1858, Parliament passed legislation that ended company rule entirely. The East India Company was stripped of its powers. Its army, territory, and administration were transferred directly to the British government. This moment marked a fundamental shift. India was no longer ruled by merchants. It was now ruled by the British Crown. For the first time, Britain openly accepted responsibility for governing the subcontinent. The era of company empire was over. The era of formal imperial rule had begun. To signal this transformation, Britain needed more than laws. It needed symbolism. Authority had to be redefined. In 1876, Queen Victoria was officially proclaimed Empress of India. This was not just a title, it was a statement. India was now central to Britain's global identity. The empire was no longer pretending to be a trading power. It was openly imperial. The new system was designed to prevent another uprising. British administrators promised reforms. They pledged to respect religion and custom. Indian princes were reassured that their status would be protected. The government presented itself as more just, more careful, and more humane than the company that came before it. But while the language softened, control tightened. The British Crown reorganized administration across India. Power was centralized under a viceroy who ruled on behalf of the monarch. British officials filled the highest positions in government, law, and finance. Indians were largely excluded from meaningful decision-making. Local rulers remained, but their authority was limited and dependent on British approval. One lesson from 1857 dominated every policy that followed. Unity among Indians was dangerous. Division was security. The British reinforced differences of religion, caste, and region. Separate legal codes were emphasized. Representation was fragmented. Communities were encouraged to see themselves as distinct rather than united. This was not accidental. It was deliberate imperial strategy. At the same time, the army was reorganized. The proportion of Indian soldiers was reduced in sensitive units. Recruitment was shifted toward groups the British believed were more loyal. Artillery and advanced weaponry were kept firmly under British control. The military was redesigned not just to fight enemies, but to prevent rebellion. Economically, the system remained extractive. India continued to supply raw materials to British industries while importing finished goods from Britain. Railways expanded rapidly, but their primary purpose was efficiency of control, not development. They allowed troops to move quickly and resources to be transported cheaply to ports. To British observers, this appeared as progress. To Indians, it often felt like continuation under a new name. Yet the Crown understood something the company never fully did. Image mattered. British officials began to present their rule as moral and civilizing. Education systems were expanded, but they favored British values and language. Legal reforms were introduced, but they reflected British priorities. Infrastructure projects were publicized as gifts of empire, even when their benefits were uneven. This new imperial order was more careful, more systematic, and more self-aware. But it was also more deeply entrenched. The rebellion of 1857 haunted British administrators. Fear shaped governance. Suspicion shaped policy. Every protest, every gathering, every sign of dissent was watched closely. The empire ruled with confidence on the surface, but anxiety beneath. For Indians, the shift to crown rule brought mixed realities. Some stability returned. Arbitrary company abuses declined. But the fundamental structure of inequality remained unchanged. Political power stayed British. Economic control stayed British. Cultural authority stayed British. What changed most was clarity. There was no longer any illusion about who ruled India. It was not a company. It was an empire. This clarity would prove powerful in the years to come. Resistance did not disappear. It evolved. Where rebellion had once been sudden and violent, it now became organized, political, and ideological. Educated Indians began to question imperial legitimacy, using British laws and institutions themselves. New movements began to form, quietly at first, then more openly. Britain believed it had secured its empire by taking direct control. In reality, it had planted the seeds of a more enduring challenge. By stepping out from behind the East India Company, the British Crown accepted responsibility not just for ruling India, but for justifying that rule. And justification would become harder with every passing decade. The empire had survived its greatest shock. But survival was not the same as stability. The British Empire in India was now stronger, more centralized, and more visible than ever before. It was also more vulnerable in ways it did not yet fully understand. The age of crown rule had begun, and with it, a new phase of empire, one defined not only by power, but by resistance that would no longer fade into silence.